It's a Thursday evening in October. I'm standing outside a restaurant in the kind of dress that makes you walk differently, shoulders back, chin up, like your spine finally remembered what it was built for. My hair is done, my skin is clear, I have a reservation under my name, and the hostess smiles at me like I belong there, because I do. And across the lobby, leaning against the bar with a drink in his hand and a look on his face I hadn't seen in 3 years, there he is. He doesn't recognize me at first. That's the part nobody tells you about transformation. Sometimes it's so complete that the people who once defined you have to do a double take to find you again. His eyes pass over me once, then they come back, and in the space between that first look and that second look, I watched something move across his face that I'd spent 2 years trying not to need from him. Regret. He smiled, that familiar smile I used to orbit my entire personality around. He raised his hand in a small wave, like we were old friends catching up, like he hadn't once looked me dead in the eyes and told me, in that tired, clinical voice that people use when they want to wound you without getting their hands dirty, that I was too much, that I was needy, that loving me was exhausting. I smiled back, and I walked to my table, alone, on purpose, happy. I didn't scream, I didn't fight back. I just became someone they never expected. This is that story. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time. Either way, I'm glad you're here. This story isn't about revenge, it's about becoming. It's about what happens when someone strips you down to your most raw, most uncertain, most vulnerable self, and instead of staying there, you build, quietly, slowly, with no audience and no applause. Just you, your reflection, and a decision you make every single morning when the alarm goes off and the work starts again. If you're watching this because someone called you too much, too sensitive, too needy, too emotional, stay. This one's for you. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. Every single week, I put out stories like this one, stories about real transformation, about the kind of glow-up that starts on the inside and works its way out until the whole world has to adjust its eyes just to look at you. Let's get into it. Let me take you back, not to the breakup, not to the night it all fell apart. Let me take you back further, back to who I was before any of this happened, because the truth is, what he said to me landed so hard because part of me already believed it. I grew up as the kid who felt things deeply. That's not a therapy buzzword, that's just the honest description of what it was like to be me. I felt everything at full volume: joy, hurt, disappointment, love. All of it turned up to 10 while everyone around me seemed to be running at a polite, manageable 6. My family wasn't cruel, they weren't neglectful, but they were practical. My dad had a saying, "Stop making a production out of everything." He said it gently, but he said it often, and slowly, over years of hearing it, I started to understand that the way I experienced the world, intensely, loudly, with my whole chest, was somehow a problem. So I shrank. Not all at once, it was gradual, the way erosion works. A little sand at a time until the cliff looks different and you can't quite remember what the original edge looked like. I stopped crying at movies when other people were around. I started editing my texts before I sent them, removing the extra exclamation points, the second and third follow-up messages, the "did I do something wrong?" questions I was desperate to ask but knew were too much. I became very good at performing calm. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had built an entire personality around being easygoing, low maintenance, the cool girl who didn't make a big deal out of anything. I was proud of it. I thought I'd grown out of my sensitivity. I thought I'd evolved. What I'd actually done was bury everything so deep that I'd lost the ability to tell the difference between "I'm okay" and "I'm pretending to be okay." And then I met Marcus. I'm not going to describe him in a way that makes him a villain, because the truth is more complicated than that, and I think you deserve the complicated version. Marcus was smart,
genuinely, impressively smart, the kind of person who reads things nobody assigned them and has opinions about architecture and can make any stranger at a party feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was funny. He was attentive, at first, in that way that some people are attentive when they're deciding whether you're worth their energy. I fell fast. Of course I did. I'd spent years starving something inside me that was desperate to be seen and chosen, and here was someone who seemed to see me, who asked follow-up questions, who remembered small things I'd mentioned weeks earlier. We were together for 2 years and 4 months. I counted later when I was trying to make sense of the math of it all, how long it takes to build something and how quickly it can be reduced to rubble. The first year was good. Not perfect, nothing is, but genuinely good. We laughed a lot. We built rituals. Sunday mornings with coffee and competing newspapers. The playlist we made together on a road trip to the coast that I still can't listen to without feeling the particular ache of something that used to be beautiful. But somewhere in the second year, something shifted. He got a promotion. His world got bigger. New colleagues, new social circles, longer hours, new versions of himself he was trying on. And I got smaller. Not on purpose, not with any awareness at first, but I can see it now with the clarity that only comes from distance. I started collapsing my world around him, canceling plans with friends when he wanted to spend time together, rearranging my schedule to fit his, checking my phone constantly to see if he'd replied, measuring my mood by the temperature of his texts. I became dependent on him the way a plant becomes dependent on the only window in the room. Turn that window away, even a little, and the whole thing starts to lean. He noticed before I did. Of course he did. It started with small comments. You don't have to text back immediately, you know, said with a smile, but the smile was tired. Then, I think you need more of your own stuff going on, said with kindness, but the kindness had an edge. Then, one night in February after I'd asked, for the third time that week, if everything was okay between us, if he was okay, if we were okay. He set down his fork. He looked at me the way people look at something they've been patient with for a long time and have finally decided they're done being patient with. And he said, "This is the problem. You're exhausting to love. You need constant reassurance. You're needy, and I can't keep being the person who fixes that for you." I didn't say anything. That's the thing nobody tells you about being truly wounded by words. You don't always cry. You don't always shout back. Sometimes you just go very still, the way the world goes still in the seconds before something structural gives way. My face stayed composed. My hands stayed folded in my lap. Something in my chest went very, very quiet. We broke up 3 weeks later. It was mutual on paper. In reality, I had spent those 3 weeks trying to fix it, researching attachment theory at midnight, making lists of how I could be less, doing the emotional equivalent of making myself as small as possible in the hope that if I just took up less space, there would be room enough for both of us. There wasn't, and the night it was officially over, I drove home, walked into my bathroom floor, because somehow that's always where it happens, the real falling apart, always the bathroom floor, and I let myself feel every single thing I'd been suppressing for years. It wasn't just about Marcus. That's what I understood sitting on that cold tile, ugly crying in a way I hadn't allowed myself since I was a child. It wasn't just grief over a relationship. It was something older and deeper, the grief of someone who had spent their entire adult life contorting themselves to be acceptable and who had finally run out of positions to try. I cried for a long time. And then I got up. Not because I was strong, I want to be honest about that. I got up because my legs had gone numb and it was uncomfortable to stay down. But I got up. And that's when everything started to change. Here's what I want to tell you about the decision to change. It wasn't dramatic. There was no cinematic moment where I stared at my reflection and declared war on my old self. There was no montage music, no sudden clarity. The decision was quiet, and it was made about 40 times over the course of the first month, because the decision isn't something you make once. It's something you make every day, sometimes every hour, sometimes every 20 minutes when the spiral starts again and you have to physically choose to step out of it. But let me tell you about the first real moment. It was about 2 weeks after the breakup. I'd been doing what a lot of us do in that early grief period, existing mostly on takeout and television and the particular comfort of telling the story over and over to every friend who would listen, like repetition might eventually make it make sense. My best friend Diane had been patient, remarkably patient, but 2 weeks in, she said something that cracked something open in me. She said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to not get defensive." I nodded. She said, "Before Marcus, who were you?" I opened my mouth to answer, and I couldn't. Not because I didn't know who I was. I thought I did. I had a job, I had opinions, I had a personality. But when Diane asked that specific question with that specific look on her face, I realized I couldn't describe myself without referencing him. My routine had been built around his schedule. My social life had slowly been whittled down to mostly his friends. My hobbies had drifted toward things he was interested in. My identity, without him as its anchor, was blurry, undefined, like a picture that's only ever been stored as a reflection in someone else's eyes. That terrified me more than the breakup. I drove home that night and I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I made a list. Old-fashioned, pen and paper, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of water because I'd decided, that night, somewhat arbitrarily, to stop drinking wine as a coping mechanism, at least for a while. The list had 2 columns. Column 1, who I was before I learned to shrink. Column 2, who I want to be. Column 1 was hard to fill. I had to go back, way back. I used to paint, not well, but joyfully. I used to run, not competitively, just the long, slow kind, where you're really just thinking in motion. I used to read voraciously, anything I could get my hands on. Used to finish 2 or 3 books a month. I used to have opinions I shared out loud without first calculating whether they would be welcome. I used to be funny, not in a performing for validation way, but genuinely, spontaneously funny in the way that only comes when you're actually comfortable. I'd lost all of it, gradually, without noticing, like losing coins from a hole in your pocket. You never feel the individual losses, only the empty weight of what's gone. Column 2 took longer to write because I wasn't just writing who I wanted to be as a reaction to what Marcus had said. I had to be careful about that. I could feel the pull of spite, the desire to transform entirely to prove him wrong, to build a version of myself that was essentially a message to him. And I knew, even then, that revenge motivation burns fast and dirty. It's jet fuel, explosive to start, but it leaves residue and it runs out. I didn't want to do this for him. I needed to do it for the version of myself sitting on that bathroom floor who had spent 27 years trying to be acceptable to everyone except herself. So here's what I decided. I'm going to give you the actual plan, not the glossy version, the real one with the embarrassing early steps and the false starts and the weeks where nothing seemed to be working. First thing I did, I called a therapist. I know, that sounds like the obvious answer, and maybe it is, but I want to tell you why it was significant for me specifically. I had been resistant to therapy for years because somewhere in my brain, going to therapy was an admission that I was as broken as people seemed to think I was, that the needy girl really did need help, that they'd been right. It took me getting to rock bottom to understand that needing help is not a character flaw. It is, in fact, one of the most self-aware and courageous things a person can do. The people who need the most help and refuse to get it, those are the ones who end up as cautionary tales. I didn't want to be a cautionary tale. I wanted to be a case study in redemption. So I made the appointment, sat across from a woman named Dr. Reyes in a small office with too many plants, and when she asked me what brought me in, I said, "I want to understand why I disappear into other people." She nodded like she'd heard this before. She had. That helped. We're not going to spend a lot of time in the therapy room because that's private and it belongs to me, but I'll tell you the single most useful thing I learned in those first 3 months of sessions. Anxiety is not a personality trait.
I had been treating my anxiety, specifically my anxious attachment, my need for constant reassurance, my hypervigilance around whether people were pleased with me, as just who I was, as an immovable feature of my personality that other people had to accommodate or leave. What I hadn't understood was that it was a learned response, something that had developed for real reasons, had served a real purpose at a real point in my life, and could, with work, with time, with intention, be unlearned. That single reframe changed everything, because it meant I wasn't broken. I was adapted, and adaptations, by definition, can adapt again. Month 1. Therapy every week. Running again, and I use running loosely because the first time I went out, I made it 6 minutes before I had to stop and walk, and I was humbled in a way that was actually clarifying. 6 minutes. That's where I was starting from. 6 minutes of actual effort before my body, which I had been feeding takeout and neglecting for months, said, "Nope, we're not doing this." I didn't go home and feel sorry for myself. I noted the baseline. I went out again 2 days later and made it 9 minutes. 2 days after that, 11. By the end of month 1, I was running 25 minutes without stopping. I also started doing something that felt deeply uncomfortable at first. I started spending time alone on purpose. This sounds simple. It wasn't. For someone with anxious attachment, solitude is a kind of exposure therapy. It's just you and the thoughts you've been out running. For the first couple weeks, I'd sit in my apartment on a Saturday afternoon, no plans, no distractions, no phone in my hand, and I would feel a physical restlessness, like my skin was too tight. The need to reach out to someone, to text, to call, to fill the silence with another person's presence was almost overwhelming. I sat with it anyway. Dr. Reyes called it building the capacity for aloneness. She said people who are afraid to be alone often don't know themselves because self-knowledge requires the silence in which the self can actually speak. I started listening. Month 2. I signed up for a pottery class on Tuesday evenings. I want to be specific about this because I think we romanticize the picking up a new hobby part of any transformation story, and I want you to understand how unglamorous it actually was. I was terrible at pottery. Genuinely terrible. My first 3 attempts at centering the clay ended with the whole thing flying off the wheel. Once it hit the person next to me, she was gracious about it. I was mortified. But I kept going. Because the goal of the pottery class was never to become a potter. The goal was to do something where I was a beginner, where I was allowed to be bad, where there was no performance required, no impression to manage, where I could show up and be clumsy and uncertain, and it didn't matter, because that's what beginners are supposed to be. We don't talk enough about the importance of being a beginner again when you're rebuilding yourself. There's something about learning a skill from scratch, about not knowing and surviving the not knowing, that rebuilds your relationship with failure in a way that nothing else quite does. By month 3, my bowls still looked more like ashtrays, but I was centering the clay consistently. Small wins, always the small wins. Month 3, the running was at 40 minutes. I'd lost 8 pounds, which wasn't the goal. The goal was the motion, the discipline, the daily proof that I could do hard things. But I noticed my clothes fitting differently, and I won't pretend that felt bad. I started cooking actual meals, not complicated ones. I'm not going to tell you I became a gourmet chef overnight, but real food, made with intention. I started reading again.
working through a stack of books I'd been meaning to get to for years. I reread some old favorites. I started keeping a journal, which I hated at first and then couldn't live without. But here's the thing I want to be honest about. Month 3 was also when I hit my first real wall. There was a Tuesday in March. I remember it specifically because it was raining and I had a pottery class and I almost didn't go, when I sat in my car outside the studio and thought, what's the point of any of this? The progress felt slow. The loneliness was still loud. I hadn't spoken to Marcus since the breakup, which was the right call, but the silence sometimes felt like a presence of its own. I'd had 3 therapy sessions in a row where it felt like we were just circling the same territory. My job felt meaningless. My apartment felt temporary, like I was just passing through my own life. I sat in that parking lot for 17 minutes. I looked it up later. I'd been tracking things obsessively in my journal by this point, trying to understand my own patterns. 17 minutes of sitting in the rain, talking myself into and out of giving up. Then I went to class. Not because I had some great revelation, not because I suddenly believed in myself. I went because I had already paid for the class, and I hate wasting money, and that is the unsexy truth of how a lot of transformation happens. You just keep showing up for reasons that have nothing to do with inspiration. That night, something unexpected happened. The instructor was demonstrating a throwing technique, and she paused to look at something I'd made, a small lopsided vase that I'd been trying on. And she said, "Your lines are getting really intentional. I can see the confidence in the form." It was a small thing, a throwaway comment from a pottery teacher on a rainy Tuesday. I drove home and cried, the good kind, because it was the first time in months that someone had looked at something I'd made entirely by myself. Not a meal I'd cooked for someone else, not an effort made for someone else's comfort, and told me it was good. I hadn't realized how hungry I was for that. The difference was, this time, the recognition was for something that was entirely mine. And that's when everything started to change. Let me tell you what transformation actually looks like from the inside. It doesn't look like a montage. It doesn't look like a series of triumphant moments. It looks mostly like Tuesday, like Wednesday, like showing up on the days you don't feel like showing up, and watching, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the needle move. By month 4, I had run my first 5K. Not a race, just me, alone, on a Saturday morning, measuring a 5K route on my running app and completing it. I finished in 38 minutes, which is not a competitive time by any measure, but when I crossed my self-designated finish line, a specific crack in the sidewalk 2 blocks from my apartment, I stopped and I stood there and I let myself feel it completely. 38 minutes. 3 months ago, I'd made it 6. Something was shifting in how I moved through the world. It was subtle first. I noticed it in small things. I stopped apologizing for existing in conversations. I stopped editing my sentences before speaking them. I stopped looking around to gauge people's reactions before I'd even finished a thought. That anxious habit of reading the room that was really just searching for permission. I started taking up more space. Not loudly, not aggressively, just appropriately, normally, the way a person is supposed to take up space. Dr. Reyes and I had been working on a specific exercise she called the pause. Every time I felt the urge to seek reassurance from someone, to send the follow-up text, to ask, "Are we okay?" to check in when my gut was signaling anxiety rather than genuine concern, I was supposed to pause, 10 breaths. And in those 10 breaths, ask myself, is this information I need, or is this anxiety asking me to feed it? Anxiety, I was learning, is like a stray cat. If you feed it every time it shows up, it moves in. I started letting it sit at the door without feeding it. Month 5. Something happened that I need to tell you about because it was one of the most significant moments of the whole process, and it didn't happen on a mountaintop or in a therapy session. It happened in a work meeting. I work in marketing, content strategy specifically. I'm good at it. I've always known I was good at it, but I had this habit of underselling my ideas, of presenting them with apologies built in. I don't know if this will work, but maybe, or this might be a bad idea, but the preemptive hedging of someone who expects rejection and wants to soften the blow by rejecting themselves first. In this particular meeting, my director, a woman I deeply respect named Jordan, was presenting a strategy I genuinely disagreed with, not out of ego, out of data. I had spent a week researching a competing approach, and the evidence was pretty clear. Old me would have waited until after the meeting, found a quiet moment, maybe sent an email, hedged, qualified, softened. Instead, I raised my hand. I said, "I've been looking at something that might offer a different perspective. Can I share?" And I shared it, clearly, directly, without apology. The meeting went on. Jordan thanked me. Later, she came to my desk and said she wanted to look at my research more carefully. 3 weeks later, we pivoted to the strategy I'd proposed. The campaign that resulted from it was our highest performing quarter in 2 years. I'm telling you this not to brag. I'm telling you this because that meeting was the moment I understood that my voice, my actual, unhedged, unqualified voice, had value. That taking up space professionally wasn't aggression, it was competency, and I had been diluting mine for years out of fear. The raise that followed 2 months later, 18%, was not incidental. Let me talk about the social piece, because I think this is where a lot of transformation stories get glossy, and I don't want to do that to you. When I started pulling back from my Marcus-era social world, which had been primarily his friends, his networks, his circles, I went through a period of genuine social loneliness. Not the dramatic, movie montage kind, the quiet, Sunday afternoon kind, where you scroll through your contacts looking for someone to call and realize you've let so many connections atrophy that the list is shorter than it should be. I reached back out to people I drifted from. Some of those conversations were a little awkward. There's a particular kind of catch-up conversation where both people are navigating the unspoken question of, why did we stop talking? But most of them were wonderful. People are generally more forgiving of lapsed friendships than we expect them to be, especially if you're the one who reaches out first. I also made new friends. This sounds simple and is profoundly hard when you're in your late 20s. I made them through the pottery class, through a book club I joined somewhat on a whim, through a running group I found through an app that I joined at month 5 when my solo runs were getting lonely in a way that felt ready to be social. By month 6, I had a social life that was genuinely mine, not inherited from a relationship, not constructed to please or impress anyone, built from my own choices, my own interests, my own reaching out. Month 6 also brought something I wasn't expecting: attention. I want to be careful about how I say this because I don't want the point of this story to be that I transformed myself to become more attractive, because that was never the goal. But the truth is, and I think it's worth naming honestly, when you start taking care of yourself with genuine intention, when you start walking differently because your body is stronger and your mind is quieter, when you stop performing and start just being, people notice. I'm not talking about the kind of attention that was ever really the point. I'm talking about the quality of it changing. The way people listened when I spoke. The way new people I met seemed genuinely interested, rather than politely tolerant. The way I started being invited to things, not because I'd made myself useful or agreeable, but because people actually wanted me there. That distinction matters enormously to someone who had spent years making herself small in the hope of being wanted. I went on 3 dates over those months. They're not the point of the story. None of them turned into anything significant, but they matter to mention because of how I showed up for them. I didn't arrive hoping to be chosen. I arrived curious about whether I was choosing. I didn't spend the days afterward obsessing over whether they'd text, cataloging every moment for evidence of whether I was likable enough. I just assessed, enjoyed, let things unfold without white-knuckling the outcome. One of the guys texted the next day and asked to meet again, and I thought about it genuinely, not anxiously, genuinely, and realized I wasn't interested, and I said so, kindly but clearly. No hedging. Old me would have gone on 4 more dates out of fear of hurting his feelings and eventually ghosted him because I was too scared to be honest. New me just told the truth. Month 7. The running was up to 10 kilometers. The pottery instructor had asked if I'd be interested in showing a few pieces at a local gallery event the studio was participating in. My pieces, the ones I'd made with my own hands, on Tuesday evenings in a room where nobody knew me as anyone's girlfriend, were going to be in public. I said yes before I had time to overthink it. The gallery event was a Thursday in September. I wore something I'd bought for myself, not for anyone's approval. My friends came, the real ones, the new ones. Diane, who had started all of this with her one pointed question. We drank mediocre wine from plastic cups, and I stood next to a small table that held 3 of my pieces, still lopsided, still imperfect, still mine, and I felt something settle in me that I can only describe as rightness. Like something that had been slightly off-center for years had finally clicked into alignment. I want to tell you about the internal shift, because the external stuff, the body changes, the professional wins, the social rebuilding, all of that is real and it matters, but it's downstream of something that happened inside me that I think is actually the most important part of this whole story. I stopped needing Marcus to have been wrong. That sounds small. It wasn't. For months, I had been, without fully admitting it, building my transformation partially as proof that he had been wrong about me, proof that I wasn't actually needy, wasn't actually too much, wasn't actually exhausting. I was building a version of myself that would, eventually, be irrefutable evidence that he'd misjudged me. But somewhere around month 7, I realized something important. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether he was wrong. It doesn't matter whether he ever knows what I became. It doesn't matter whether he regrets it, whether he misses me, whether he comes back. Because I am not building this for him. I am building this because I deserve to live in a body I've cared for. I deserve to have work that reflects my actual voice. I deserve to have friendships that are chosen rather than inherited. I deserve to be in a room and take up the exact right amount of space without apologizing for any of it. That is when the transformation became complete. Not when the scale showed a different number, not when I got the raise, not when my pieces went up in the gallery. It was complete when I stopped looking over my shoulder to see if anyone was watching, when I stopped running from something and started running toward myself. And that's when everything started to change. So, October, month 8. My friend Priya was celebrating her birthday with a dinner at a place in the city, one of those restaurants that has a 2-month wait list and a menu that changes seasonally and candles on every table. She had 7 of us on the reservation. I had a new dress, deep burgundy, nothing dramatic, just the kind of dress that makes you feel like the best version of yourself. And I was in a genuinely good mood, the kind that doesn't require anything external to maintain itself. I drove myself. I arrived early. The hostess smiled at me, checked my name, and I walked in. I saw him at the bar before he saw me. Marcus. With 2 people I didn't recognize, a man and a woman. Colleagues, maybe, from the way they were talking. His jacket looked slightly rumpled, which was unusual. He was always meticulous about his appearance. He looked, and I'm trying to be accurate here, not unkind, tired. Not in a one bad night way, in a deeper way. Like something in him had been working overtime for a while. My first emotion, I want to be honest with you, was not triumph. It was something closer to compassion. Quiet and surprising and completely outside what I'd imagined I would feel in this moment, in those early months when I'd rehearsed the encounter in my head the way we all do, picturing ourselves luminous and indifferent while they crumbled. The truth was softer than the fantasy. He turned and our eyes met. The double take, the slow recognition, and then the smile. The same smile in the same form, but arriving this time from a different place on his face, not confident, tentative, almost asking permission. He said something to his colleagues, set down his drink, and walked over. Hey. His voice had the careful quality of someone who has spent time preparing what they might say and then arrived at the moment and felt all of it dissolve. Wow, you look incredible. Old me would have done something with that. Old me would have needed it, would have stored it away and turned it over and measured its meaning and spent days analyzing the exact word choices. He said incredible. He said wow. He came over. What does that mean? New me just said, "Thank you. It's good to see you, Marcus," and meant it. Uncomplicated, complete. He asked how I was. I told him the truth, that I was well, genuinely well, in the specific ways that people sometimes say that and don't mean it, and sometimes say it and mean it completely. I told him briefly about the campaign, the raise. He looked genuinely pleased. And also, I could see it clearly, the way you see things clearly when you're no longer invested in their interpretation, slightly undone by it, like someone watching a chess piece move to a square they didn't anticipate. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said, "I've actually been going through something rough. We should catch up sometime. I've thought about you a lot." There it was. The thing I'd imagined in 100 versions over 8 months. The coming back, the admission, the opening. And I felt nothing complicated, just clear. I said, "I'm really sorry you're going through something hard. I hope you find the support you need." He blinked. Yeah, thank you. I should get to my table. Priya's birthday. Right, yeah, of course. He smiled again, smaller this time. "It's really good to see you." "You too," I said, and walked away. I want to sit in that moment with you for a second because I think it's easy to describe it as coldness, and it wasn't. It was something much harder to achieve than coldness. Coldness still cares in its own way. It's just hurt wearing armor. What I felt walking to that table was warmth, and genuine completion. I didn't need his regret. I didn't need his "I've thought about you." I didn't need the comeback, the story, the vindication. I'd already gotten the thing I actually needed months ago, quietly, on a Tuesday evening next to a pottery wheel. I sat down at Priya's table. My friends were already opening wine and passing menus and doing the beautiful, ordinary work of an evening together. Diane looked up and immediately clocked something on my face. She knows me, in the way that the people you build yourself around tend to know you. She said quietly, "You okay?" I said, "Better than okay." And I meant that in all the ways. He texted 3 days later. I want to tell you what it said, but more than that, I want to tell you what it meant. The text was long, the kind of long text that people write when they've been sitting with something for days and finally decide to just release it. It talked about where he was, professionally struggling, a relationship he'd been in after me that had ended badly, feeling generally unmoored. And then, at the end of it, in the specific language of someone who is asking for something without quite admitting they're asking, "I've been thinking about where we went wrong. I think I was too hard on you. I think I was wrong about what I called needing too much." I read it twice. Then I put down my phone. Then I picked it back up and read it once more. I thought about what I would have done with this text 8 months ago. I thought about the version of me who would have responded within 30 seconds, who would have spent the next 72 hours in a state of heightened, anxious hope, who would have started reconstructing the whole architecture of a relationship on the foundation of one long text from someone who was hurting and reaching for familiar comfort. And then I thought about Tuesday evenings, about 6 minutes becoming 10, becoming 40, about the voice I'd found in a conference room, about the pieces on a gallery table that were mine. I typed back, "I appreciate you saying that. I hope you're okay. Take good care of yourself, Marcus." Sent it. Turned my phone face down, made dinner. I'm not going to tell you he never texted again, because he did, twice more over the next few weeks, each time a little more transparent about the reaching, And each time I responded with warmth and brevity, the way you respond to someone you once loved and no longer need to, the way you respond when you've completed the work of releasing something without bitterness, which is a very specific and very hard thing to do, and which I have enormous respect for, in myself and in anyone who manages it.
Because here is what I want you to understand. This was never about him coming back. This was never about him realizing what he lost, or regretting what he said, or arriving at the conclusion that he'd underestimated me. Those things happened, and they're satisfying in the minor human way that small justices often are, but they were side effects, consequences of a process that was never pointed at him. He said I was needy. And he wasn't entirely wrong. I was anxiously attached, looking outside myself for a sense of security that had to be built from within. The difference between the old me and the new me isn't that I proved him wrong, it's that I fixed what he was describing. Not for him, not to prove a point, for myself, because I deserved to live in a body and mind and life that felt like mine, fully, completely, without qualification. That's the actual revenge. Not the moment at the bar, not the text, not his regret. The actual revenge is that I am now, on any given Tuesday, more content sitting alone with my thoughts than I used to be surrounded by noise and people and one person's approval. The actual revenge is that I don't need anyone to tell me I'm okay. I know that I am. I want to tell you one more thing before we get to the end. About 6 weeks after the restaurant, I signed up for a half marathon, 13.1 miles. I ran it in 2 hours and 14 minutes. I cried at mile 11, not from pain, just from the strange, overwhelming joy of being in a body that could do this, that I had built back to this, from 6 minutes on a cold October morning 11 months before. At the finish line, nobody was waiting for me with a sign. Diane had offered to come, but I'd told her not to. This one I wanted to do alone, to cross alone, to feel alone. Not because I don't love my people, because I wanted to know what it felt like to be enough, all by myself, at the end of something hard. It felt like the bathroom floor. The good version, the version where you get up. So, here we are. The best revenge is living well.
But, and I need you to hear this part, only if you're doing it for yourself. If you're transforming to prove someone wrong, you'll get partway there and run out of fuel, because spite is a sprint, not a marathon. Because the moment the person who hurt you stops watching, spite has nothing left to run on. But if you're doing it for yourself, that's renewable energy. That's the kind of fuel that doesn't run out because the tank keeps refilling. Every time you show up on a hard day, every time you choose yourself over the performance of someone else's approval, every time you do the thing even though nobody's watching. So let me leave you with the actual practical stuff. The things that, looking back, made the most difference. Not the big cinematic moments, the small, unglamorous Tuesday things. 1. Identify one place in your life where you're performing, where you're being a version of yourself that exists to manage someone else's comfort. Start there. Not everywhere at once, one place. 2. Build one thing that's entirely yours. A skill, a practice, a project. Something you do even if nobody knew about it, especially if nobody knew about it. 3. Move your body. I don't care how. 6 minutes, a walk, a swim, some form of motion that is just between you and your body, no audience required, every day. The relationship between physical movement and emotional regulation is not a trend, it's biology. 4. Sit with yourself uncomfortably. 10 minutes a day of not reaching for your phone, not filling the silence. Let yourself be bored. Let yourself be present. Let yourself hear what your thoughts actually sound like when they're not drowning in distraction. It will be uncomfortable. You will survive it. And slowly, over weeks, you'll start to sound like someone you'd actually choose to spend time with. 5. Get help if you need it. Therapy, a mentor, a really honest conversation with a friend who knows you well enough to ask the uncomfortable questions. Needing support is not the same as being needy. Knowing the difference is wisdom. And finally, the hardest one and the most important. Decide that you are worth the effort. Not when you're thinner, not when you're more successful, not when someone better comes along and validates the decision. Now, as you are at whatever stage of the mess you're currently in. You are worth the 6-minute run. You are worth the therapy appointment. You are worth the pottery class and the book club and the reaching back out to the friend you've been missing. You are worth the long, quiet, unglamorous work of becoming who you actually are.
I didn't set out to become unreachable to the person who once made me feel like I was too much. I set out to become real to myself. The rest, the encounter, the text, the look on his face at the bar, that was just the universe being a little theatrical about something that was already done. The victory happened on a Tuesday in March, in the rain when I went to the pottery class anyway. The victory happened at 6:07 a.m. on a Sunday, when my alarm went off and I was tired and it was cold and I got up and ran anyway. The victory happened in a conference room when I raised my hand and used my actual voice. It's been happening every single day since I decided to stop performing and start being. What's your glow-up story? I mean that sincerely. Drop it in the comments. Not the glossy version, the real one, the parking lot version, the bathroom floor version, the 6-minute run version. Because I promise you, someone is going to scroll down and read exactly what you wrote at exactly the right moment, and it's going to change the whole direction of their Tuesday. That's how this works. That's always how this works. I'll see you next week. Take care of yourself, like you mean it.